Hello again. I'm your imaginary friend. Welcome back to The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. If you've missed the first session, go find that. We'll get right into it. Part 5, The Letter of Advice. Do you know, Austin, said Villiers, as the two friends were pacing sedately along Piccadilly one pleasant morning in May. Do you know, I'm convinced that what you told me about Paul Street and the Herberts is a mere episode in an extraordinary history. I may as well confess to you that when I asked you about Herbert a few months ago, I had just seen him. You'd seen him? Where? He begged of me in the street one night. He was in the most pitiable plight, but I recognized the man, and I got him to tell me his history, or at least the outline of it. In brief, it amounted to this. He'd been ruined by his wife. In what manner? He would not tell me. He would only say that she had destroyed him, body and soul. The man is dead now. And what has become of his wife? Ah, that's what I should like to know, and I mean to find her sooner or later. I know a man named Clark, a dry fellow. In fact, a man of business, but shrewd enough. You understand my meaning, not shrewd in the mere business sense of the word, but a man who really knows something about men and life. Well, I laid the case before him, and he was evidently impressed. He said it needed consideration and asked me to come again in the course of a week. A few days later, I received this extraordinary letter. Austin took the envelope, drew out the letter, and read it curiously. It ran as follows. My dear Villiers, I have thought over the matter on which you consulted me the other night, and my advice to you is this. Throw the portrait into the fire, blot out the story from your mind. Never give it another thought, Villiers, or you will be sorry. You will think, no doubt, that I am in possession of some secret information, and to a certain extent that is the case, but I only know a little. I'm like a traveler who has peered over an abyss and is drawn back in terror. What I know is strange enough and horrible enough, but beyond my knowledge there are depths and horrors more frightful still, more incredible than any tale told of winter nights about the fire. I have resolved, and nothing shall shake that resolve, to explore no whit farther, and if you value your happiness, you will make the same determination. Come and see me by all means, but we will talk on more cheerful topics than this. Austin folded the letter methodically and returned it to Villiers. It is certainly an extraordinary letter, he said, but what does he mean by the portrait? Oh, I forgot to tell you that I've been to Paul Street and have made a discovery. Villiers told his story as he had told it to Clark, and Austin listened in silence. He seemed puzzled. I'm very curious that you should experience such an unpleasant sensation in that room, he said at length. I hardly gather it was a mere matter of the imagination, a feeling of repulsion, in short. No, it was more physical than mental. It was as if I were inhaling at every breath some deadly fume, which seemed to penetrate to every nerve and bone and sinew of my body. I felt racked from head to foot. My eyes began to grow dim. It was like the entrance of death. Yes, very strange, certainly. You see, your friend confesses that there is some very black story connected with this woman. Did you notice any particular emotion in him when you were telling your tale? Yes, I did. He became very faint, but he assured me that it was a mere passing attack to which he was subject. Did you believe him? I did at the time, but I don't now. He heard what I had to say with a good deal of indifference till I showed him the portrait. It was then he was seized with the attack of which I spoke. He looked ghastly, I assure you. Then he must have seen the woman before. But there might be another explanation. It might have been the name and not the face, which was familiar to him. What do you think? I couldn't say. To the best of my belief, it was after turning the portrait in his hands that he nearly dropped from his chair. The name, you know, was written on the back. Quite so. After all, it is impossible to come to any resolution in a case like this. I hate melodrama, and nothing strikes me as more commonplace and tedious than the ordinary ghost story of commerce. But really, Villiers, it looks as if there were something very queer at the bottom of all this. The two men had, without noticing it, turned up Ashley Street, leading northward from Piccadilly. It was a long street, and rather a gloomy one, but here and there a brighter taste had illuminated the dark houses with flowers and gay curtains and a cheerful paint on the doors. Villiers glanced up as Austin stopped speaking and looked at one of these houses. Geraniums, red and white, drooped from every sill, and daffodil-coloured curtains were draped back from each window. "It looks cheerful, doesn't it?" he said. "Yes, and the inside is still more cheery. One of the pleasantest houses of the season, so I've heard. I haven't been there myself, but I've met several men who have, and they tell me it's uncommonly jovial." "Whose house is it?" "A Mrs. Beaumont's."
"And who's she?"
"I couldn't tell you. I've heard she comes from South America, but after all, who she is of little consequence. She's a very wealthy woman, there's no doubt of that. And some of the best people have taken her up. I heard she has some wonderful claret. Really marvellous wine, which must have cost a fabulous sum. Lord Argentine was telling me about it. He was there last Sunday evening. He assures me he's never tasted such a wine, and Argentine, as you know, is an expert. By the way, that reminds me, she must be an oddish sort of woman, this Mrs. Beaumont. Argentine asked her how old the wine was, and what do you think she said? About 1,000 years, I believe. Lord Argentine thought she was chaffing him, you know. But when he laughed, she said she was speaking quite seriously and offered to show him the jar. Of course, he couldn't say anything more after that. But it seems rather antiquated for a beverage, doesn't it? Fine. Here we are at my rooms. Come in, won't you?"
"Thanks, I will. I haven't seen the curiosity shop for some time."
It was a room furnished richly yet oddly, where every chair and bookcase and table and every rug and jar and ornament seemed to be a thing apart, preserving each its own individuality.
"Anything fresh lately?"
said Villiers after a while. "No, I think not. You saw those queer jugs, didn't you?" "I thought so." "I don't think I've come across anything for the last few weeks." Austin glanced round the room from cupboard to cupboard, from shelf to shelf in search of some new oddity. His eyes fell at last on an old chest, pleasantly and quaintly carved, which stood in a dark corner of the room. "Ah," he said, "I was forgetting. I have got something to show you." Austin unlocked the chest, drew out a thick quarto volume, laid it on the table, and resumed the cigar he had put down. "Did you know Arthur Machen, the painter, Villiers?"
"Little. I met him 2 or 3 times at the house of a friend of mine. What has become of him? I haven't heard his name mentioned for some time."
"He's dead."
"You don't say so. Quite young, wasn't he?"
"Yes, only 30 when he died."
"What did he die of?"
"I don't know. He was an intimate friend of mine, and thoroughly good fellow. He used to come here and talk to me for hours, and he was one of the best talkers I've met. He could even talk about painting, and that's more than can be said of most painters. About 18 months ago, he was feeling rather overworked, and partly at my suggestion, he went off on a sort of roving expedition with no very definite end or aim about it. I believe New York was to be his first port, but I never heard from him. 3 months ago, I got this book with a very civil letter from an English doctor practicing at Buenos Aires, stating that he had attended the late Mr. Mayrick during his illness, and that the deceased had expressed an earnest wish that the enclosed packet should be sent to me after his death. That was all."
"And haven't you written for further particulars?"
"I've been thinking of doing so. You would advise me to write to the doctor?"
"Certainly. And what about the book?"
"It was sealed up when I got it. I don't think the doctor had seen it."
"It is something very rare? Mayrick was a collector, perhaps?"
"No, I think not. Hardly a collector. Now, what do you think of those Ainu jugs?"
"They're peculiar, but I like them. But aren't you going to show me poor Mayrick's legacy?"
Yes, to be sure. The fact is, it's rather a peculiar sort of thing, and I haven't shown it to anyone.
I wouldn't say anything about it if I were you. There it is. Villiers took the book and opened it at haphazard. It isn't a printed volume, then? He said. No, it's a collection of drawings in black and white by my poor friend Mayrick. Villiers turned to the first page. It was blank. The second bore a brief inscription, which read, Silet per diem universus, nec sine aurore secretus est. Lucet nocturnus ignibus, chorus aegipanum undique personatur. Audiuntur et cantus tibiarum, et tinnitus cymbalarum per orum maritimam. On the third page was a design which made Villiers start and look up at Austin. He was gazing abstractedly out of the window. Villiers turned page after page, absorbed, in spite of himself, in the frightful Walpurgis night of evil, strange, monstrous evil that the dead artist had set forth in hard black and white. The figures of fauns and satyrs and aegipans danced before his eyes, the darkness of the thicket, the dance on the mountain top, the scenes by lonely shores, in green vineyards, by rocks and desert places, passed before him, a world before which the human soul seemed to shrink back and shudder. Villiers whirled over the remaining pages. He'd seen enough, but the picture on the last leaf caught his eye, as he almost closed the book.
Austin!
Well, what is it?
Do you know who that is?
It was a woman's face, alone on the white page. Know who it is? No, of course not.
I do.
Who is it?
It's Mrs. Herbert.
Are you sure?
I'm perfectly certain of it. Poor Mayrick is one more chapter in her history.
What do you think of the designs?
They're frightful. Lock the book up again, Austin. If I were you, I would burn it. It must be a terrible companion, even though it be in a chest.
Yes, they are singular drawings. But I wonder what connection there could be between Mayrick and Mrs. Herbert, or what link between her and these designs.
Ah, who can say? It is possible that the matter may end here, and we shall never know, but in my own opinion, this Helen Vaughan or Mrs. Herbert is only the beginning. She will come back to London, Austin, depend upon it. She will come back, and we shall hear more about her then. I don't think it will be very pleasant news.
Part 5. The Suicides. Lord Argentine was a great favourite in London society. At 20 he'd been a poor man, decked with the surname of an illustrious family, but forced to earn a livelihood as best he could, and the most speculative of moneylenders would not have entrusted him with £50 on the chance of his ever changing his name for a title, and his poverty for a great fortune. His father had been near enough to the fountain of good things to secure one of the family livings, but the son, even if he had taken orders, would scarcely have obtained so much as this, and moreover felt no vocation for the ecclesiastical estate. Thus he fronted the world with no better armour than the bachelor's gown and the wits of a younger son's grandson, with which equipment he contrived in some way to make a very tolerable fight of it. At 25, Mr. Charles Aubremont saw himself still a man of struggles and of warfare with the world, but out of the 7 who stood between him and the high places of his family, 3 only remained. These 3, however, were good lives, but yet not proof against the Zalu assagays and typhoid fever, and so one morning Aubremont woke up and found himself Lord Argentine, a man of 30 who had faced the difficulties of existence and had conquered. The situation amused him immensely, and he resolved that riches should be as pleasant to him as poverty had always been. Argentine, after some little consideration, came to the conclusion that dining, regarded as a fine art, was perhaps the most amusing pursuit open to fallen humanity, and thus his dinners became famous in London, and an invitation to his table a thing covetously desired. After 10 years of lordship and dinners, Argentine still declined to be jaded, still persisted in enjoying life, and by a kind of infection had become recognized as the cause of joy in others, in short, as the best of company. His sudden and tragical death, therefore, caused a wide and deep sensation. People could scarce believe it, even though the newspaper was before their eyes, and the cry of "Mysterious death of a nobleman" came ringing up from the street. But there stood the brief paragraph: Lord Argentine was found dead this morning by his valet under distressing circumstances. It is stated that there can be no doubt that his lordship committed suicide, although no motive can be assigned for the act. The deceased nobleman was widely known in society and much liked for his genial manner and sumptuous hospitality. He is succeeded by, etc., etc. By slow degrees the details came to light, but the case still remained a mystery. The chief witness at the inquest was the dead nobleman's valet, who said that the night before his death Lord Argentine had dined with a lady of good position, whose name was suppressed in the newspaper reports. At about 11 o'clock Lord Argentine had returned and informed his man that he should not require his services till the next morning. A little later the valet had occasion to cross the hall, and was somewhat astonished to see his master quietly letting himself out at the front door. He had taken off his evening clothes, and was dressed in a Norfolk coat and knickerbockers, and wore a low brown hat. The valet had no reason to suppose that Lord Argentine had seen him, and though his master rarely kept late hours, thought little of the occurrence till the next morning, when he knocked at the bedroom door at 8:45 as usual. He received no answer, and after knocking 2 or 3 times, entered the room, and saw Lord Argentine's body leaning forward at an angle from the bottom of the bed. He found that his master had tied a cord securely to one of the short bedposts, and after making a running noose and slipping it round his neck, the unfortunate man must have resolutely fallen forward to die by slow strangulation. He was dressed in the light suit in which the valet had seen him go out, and the doctor who was summoned pronounced that life had been extinct for more than 4 hours. All papers, letters, and so forth seemed in perfect order, and nothing was discovered which pointed in the most remote way to any scandal, either great or small. Here the evidence ended. Nothing more could be discovered. Several persons had been present at the dinner party at which Lord Argentine had assisted, and to all these he seemed in his most usual genial spirits. The valet, indeed, said he thought his master appeared a little excited when he came home, but he confessed that the alteration in his manner was a very slight, hardly noticeable indeed. It seemed hopeless to seek for any clue, and the suggestion that Lord Argentine had been suddenly attacked by acute suicidal mania was generally accepted. It was otherwise, however, when within 3 weeks 3 more gentlemen, one of them a nobleman, and the 2 others men of good position and ample means, perished miserably in almost precisely the same manner. Lord Swanley was found one morning in his dressing-room, hanging from a peg affixed to the wall, and Mr. Collier Stewart and Mr. Herries had chosen to die as Lord Argentine. There was no explanation in either case. A few bald facts: a living man in the evening, and a dead body with a black swollen face in the morning. The police had been forced to confess themselves powerless to arrest or to explain the sordid murders of Whitechapel, but before the horrible suicides of Piccadilly and Mayfair they were dumbfounded, for not even the mere ferocity which did duty as an explanation of the crimes of the East End could be of service in the West. Each of these men, who had resolved to die a tortured, shameful death, was rich, prosperous, and to all appearances in love with the world, and not the acutest research could ferret out any shadow of a lurking motive in either case. There was a horror in the air, and men looked at one another's faces when they met, each wondering whether the other was to be the victim of the 5th nameless tragedy. Journalists sought in vain in their scrapbooks for materials whereof to concoct reminiscent articles, and the morning paper was unfolded in many a house with a feeling of awe. No man knew when or where the blow would next light. A short while after the last of these terrible events, Austin came to see Mr. Villiers. He was curious to know whether Villiers had succeeded in discovering any fresh traces of Mrs. Herbert, either through Clark or by other sources, and he asked the question soon after he had sat down. "No," said Villiers. "I wrote to Clark, but he remains obdurate. I have tried other channels, but without any result. I can't find out what became of Helen Vaughan after she left Paul Street, but I think she must have gone abroad. But to tell the truth, Austin, I haven't paid very much attention to the matter for the last few weeks.
I knew poor Harry intimately, and his terrible death has been a great shock to me. A great shock."
"I can well believe it," answered Austen gravely. "You know, Argentine was a friend of mine. If I remember rightly, we were speaking of him that day you came to my room."
"Yes, it was in connection with that house in Ashley Street, Mrs. Beaumont's house. You said something about Argentine dining there."
"Quite so. Of course, you knew it was there Argentine died the night before his death."
"Oh, I hadn't heard that."
"Oh, yes. The name was kept out of the papers to spare Mrs. Beaumont. Argentine was a great favorite of hers, and it is said that she was in a terrible state for some time after." A curious look came over Villiers' face. He seemed undecided whether to speak or not. Austen began again. "I've never experienced such a feeling of horror as when I read the account of Argentine's death. I didn't understand it at the time, and I don't now. I knew him well, and it completely passes my understanding for what possible cause he, or any of the others, for the matter of that, could have resolved in cold blood to die in such an awful manner. You know how men babble away each other's characters in London. You may be sure any buried scandal or hidden skeleton would have been brought to light in such a case as this. But nothing of the sort has taken place. As for the theory of mania, that's very well, of course, for the coroner's jury, but everybody knows that it's all nonsense. Suicidal mania is not smallpox." Austen relapsed into gloomy silence. Villiers sat silent also, watching his friend. The expression of indecision still fleeted across his face. He seemed as if weighing his thoughts in the balance, and the considerations he was revolving left him still silent. Austen tried to shake off the remembrance of tragedies as hopeless and perplexed as the labyrinth of Daedalus, and began to talk in an indifferent voice of the most pleasant incidents and adventures of the season. "That Mrs. Beaumont," he said, "of whom we were speaking, is a great success. She's taken London almost by storm. I met her the other night at Fulham's. She's really a remarkable woman."
"You've met Mrs. Beaumont?"
"Yes. She had quite a court around her. She would be called very handsome, I suppose, and yet there is something about her face which I didn't like. The features are exquisite, but the expression is strange. All the time I was looking at her, and afterwards, when I was going home, I had a curious feeling that that very expression was in some way or other familiar to me."
"You must have seen her in the Row."
"No, I'm sure I never set eyes on the woman before. It is that which makes it puzzling. And to the best of my belief, I've never seen anybody like her. What I felt was a kind of dim, far-off memory, vague but persistent. The only sensation I can compare it to is that odd feeling one sometimes has in a dream when fantastic cities and wondrous lands and phantom personages appear familiar and accustomed." Villiers nodded and glanced aimlessly round the room, possibly in search of something on which to turn the conversation. His eyes fell on an old chest somewhat like that in which the artist's strange legacy lay hid beneath a Gothic scutcheon.
"Have you written to the doctor about poor Mayrick?"
he asked. "Yes, I wrote asking for full particulars as to his illness and death. I don't expect to have an answer for another 3 weeks or a month. I thought I might as well inquire whether Mayrick knew an Englishwoman named Herbert, and if so, whether the doctor could give me any information about her. But it's very possible that Mayrick fell in with her at New York, or Mexico, or San Francisco. I've no idea as to the extent or direction of his travels."
"Yes, and it's very possible that the woman may have more than one name."
"Exactly. I wish I had thought of asking you to lend me the portrait of her which you possess. I might have enclosed it in my letter to Dr. Matthews."
"So you might. That never occurred to me. We might send it now. Hark, what are those boys calling?"
While the two men had been talking together, a confused noise of shouting had been gradually growing louder. The noise rose from the eastward and swelled down Piccadilly, drawing nearer and nearer, a very torrent of sound, surging up streets usually quiet, and making every window a frame for a face curious or excited. The cries and voices came echoing up the silent street where Villiers lived, growing more distinct as they advanced, and as Villiers spoke, an answer rang up from the pavement. "The West End horrors! Another awful suicide! Full details!" Austin rushed down the stairs and bought a paper and read out the paragraph to Villiers as the uproar in the street rose and fell. The window was open, and the air seemed full of noise and terror. Another gentleman has fallen a victim to the terrible epidemic of suicide, which for the last month has prevailed in the West End. Mr. Sidney Crashaw, of Stoke House, Fulham, and King's Pomeroy, Devon, was found after a prolonged search, hanging from the branch of a tree in his garden at 1 o'clock today. The deceased gentleman dined last night at the Carlton Club and seemed in his usual health and spirits. He left the club at about 10 o'clock and was seen walking leisurely up St. James Street a little later. Subsequent to this, his movements cannot be traced. On the discovery of the body, medical aid was at once summoned, but life had evidently been long extinct. So far as is known, Mr. Crashaw had no trouble or anxiety of any kind. This painful suicide, it will be remembered, is the fifth of the kind in the last month. The authorities at Scotland Yard are unable to suggest any explanation of these terrible occurrences. Alston put down the paper in mute horror. I shall leave London tomorrow, he said. It is a city of nightmares. How awful this is, Villiers. Mr. Villiers was sitting by the window, quietly looking out into the street. He had listened to the newspaper report attentively, and the hint of indecision was no longer on his face. Wait a moment, Alston, he replied. I've made up my mind to mention a little matter that occurred last night. You stated, I think, that Crashaw was last seen alive in St. James Street shortly after 10? Yes, I think so. I will look again. Yes, you're quite right. Quite so. Well, I'm in a position to contradict that statement, at all events. Crashaw was seen after that, considerably later indeed. How do you know? Because I happened to see Crashaw myself at about 2 o'clock this morning. You saw Crashaw? You, Villiers? Yes, I saw him quite distinctly. Indeed, there were but a few feet between us. Where in heaven's name did you see him? Not far from here. I saw him in Ashley Street. He was just leaving a house. Did you notice what house it was? Yes. It was Mrs. Beaumont's. Villiers, think what you're saying. There must be some mistake. How could Crashaw be in Mrs. Beaumont's house at 2 o'clock in the morning? Surely you must have been dreaming, Villiers. You were always rather fanciful. No, I was wide awake enough. Even if I had been dreaming, as you say, what I saw would have roused me effectually. What you saw? What did you see? Was there anything strange about Crashaw? But I can't believe it. It's impossible. Well, if you like, I will tell you what I saw, or if you please, what I think I saw, and you can judge for yourself. Very good, Villiers. The noise and clamour of the street had died away, though now and then the sound of shouting still came from the distance, and the dull leaden silence seemed like the quiet after an earthquake or a storm. Villiers turned from the window and began speaking. I was at a house near Regent's Park last night, and when I came away the fancy took me to walk home instead of taking a hansom. It was a clear, pleasant night enough, and after a few minutes I had the streets pretty much to myself. It's a curious thing, Austin, to be alone in London at night, the gas lamps stretching away in perspective, and the dead silence, and then perhaps the rush and clatter of the hansom on the stones, and the fire starting up under the horses' hoofs. I walked along pretty briskly, for I was feeling a little tired of being out in the night, and as the clocks were striking 2, I turned down Ashley Street, which, you know, is on my way. It was quieter than ever there, and the lamps were fewer. Altogether, it looked as dark and gloomy as a forest in winter. I'd done about half the length of the street when I heard a door closed very softly, and naturally I looked up to see who was abroad like myself at such an hour. As it happens, there is a street lamp close to the house in question, and I saw a man standing on the step. He just shut the door, and his face was towards me, and I recognized Crashaw directly. I never knew him to speak to, but I had often seen him, and I'm positive that I was not mistaken in my man. I looked into his face for a moment, and then, I will confess the truth, I set off at a good run, and kept it up until I was within my own door. Why? Why? Because it made my blood run cold to see that man's face. I could never have supposed that such an infernal medley of passions could have glared out of any human eyes. I almost fainted as I looked. I knew I had looked into the eyes of a lost soul, Austin.
The man's outward form remained, but all hell was within it. Furious lust and hate that was like fire, and the loss of all hope, and horror that seemed to shriek aloud to the night, though his teeth were shut, and the utter blackness of despair. I am sure he did not see me. He saw nothing that you or I can see, but he saw what I hope we never shall. I do not know when he died. I suppose in an hour or perhaps two, but when I passed down Ashley Street and heard the closing door, that man no longer belonged to this world. It was a devil's face I looked upon. There was an interval of silence in the room when Villiers ceased speaking. The light was falling, and all the tumults of an hour ago was quite hushed. Austin had bent his head at the close of the story, and his hand covered his eyes. "What can it mean?" he said at length. "Who knows, Austin? Who knows? It's a black business, but I think we had better keep it to ourselves, for the present at any rate. I will see if I cannot learn anything about that house through private channels of information. If I do light upon anything, I will let you know." Part 7. The Encounter in Soho. 3 weeks later, Austin received a note from Villiers asking him to call either that afternoon or the next. He chose the nearer date, and found Villiers sitting as usual by the window, apparently lost in meditation on the drowsy traffic of the street. There was a bamboo table by his side, a fantastic thing, enriched with gilding and queer painted scenes, and on it lay a little pile of papers, arranged and docketed as neatly as anything in Mr. Clark's office. "Well, Villiers, have you made any discoveries in the last 3 weeks?" "I think so. I have here 1 or 2 memoranda which strike me as singular, and there is a statement to which I shall call your attention." "And these documents relate to Mrs. Beaumont. It was really Crashaw whom you saw that night standing on the doorstep of the house in Ashley Street?" "As to that matter, my belief remains unchanged, but neither my inquiries nor their results have any special relation to Crashaw. But my investigations have had a strange issue. I have found out who Mrs. Beaumont is." "Who she is? In what way do you mean?" "I mean that you and I know her better under another name." "What name is that?" "Herbert." "Herbert?" Austin repeated the word, dazed with astonishment. "Yes, Mrs. Herbert of Paul Street, Helen Vaughan of earlier adventures unknown to me. You had reason to recognize the expression of her face. When you go home, look at the face in Mayrick's Book of Horrors, and you will know the sources of your recollection." "And you have proof of this?" "Yes, the best of proof. I've seen Mrs. Beaumont, or shall we say Mrs. Herbert." "Where did you see her?" "Hardly in a place where you would expect to see a lady who lives in Ashley Street, Piccadilly. I saw her entering a house in one of the meanest and most disreputable streets in Soho. In fact, I had made an appointment, though not with her, and she was precise both to time and place." "Well, this seems very wonderful, but I cannot call it incredible. You must remember, Villiers, that I have seen this woman in the ordinary adventure of London society, talking and laughing and sipping her coffee in a commonplace drawing-room with commonplace people." "But you know what you're saying." "I do. I've not allowed myself to be led by surmises or fancies. It was with no thought of finding Helen Vaughan that I searched for Mrs. Beaumont in the dark waters of the life of London. But such has been the issue." "You must have been in strange places, Villiers." "Yes, I've been in very strange places. It would have been useless, you know, to go to Ashley Street and ask Mrs. Beaumont to give me a short sketch of her previous history. No, assuming as I had to assume that her record was not of the cleanest, it would be pretty certain that at some previous time she must have moved in circles not quite so refined as her present ones. If you see mud on the top of a stream, you may be sure that it was once at the bottom. I went to the bottom. I have always been fond of diving into Queer Street for my amusement, and I found my knowledge of that locality and its inhabitants very useful.
It is perhaps needless to say that my friends have never heard the name of Beaumont, and as I have never seen the lady, I was quite unable to describe her. I had to set to work in an indirect way. The people there know me. I've been able to do some of them a service now and again, so they made no difficulty about giving their information. They were aware I had no communication, direct or indirect, with Scotland Yard. I had to cast out a good many line, though, before I got what I wanted. And when I landed the fish, I did not for a moment suppose it was my fish. But I listened to what I was told out of a constitutional liking for useless information, and I found myself in possession of a very curious story, though, as I imagined, not the story I was looking for. It was to this effect. Some 5 or 6 years ago, a woman named Raymond suddenly made her appearance in the neighborhood to which I am referring. She was described to me as being quite young, probably not more than 17 or 18, very handsome, and looking as if she came from the country. I should be wrong in saying that she found her level in going to this particular quarter or associating with these people, for from what I was told, I should think the worst den in London far too good for her. The person from whom I got my information, as you may suppose, no great Puritan, shuddered and grew sick in telling me of the nameless infamies which were laid to her charge. After living there for a year, or perhaps a little more, she disappeared as suddenly as she came, and they saw nothing of her till about the time of the Paul Street case. At first she came to her old haunts only occasionally, and then more frequently, and finally took up her abode there as before, and remained for 6 or 8 months. It's of no use my going into details as to the life that woman led. If you want particulars, you can look at Meyrick's legacy. Those designs were not drawn from his imagination. She again disappeared, and the people of the place saw nothing of her till a few months ago. My informant told me that she had taken some rooms in a house which he pointed out, and these rooms she was in the habit of visiting 2 or 3 times a week, and always at 10 in the morning. I was led to expect that one of these visits would be paid on a certain day about a week ago, and I accordingly managed to be on the lookout in company with my cicerone at the 9:45, and the hour and the lady came with equal punctuality. My friend and I were standing under an archway a little way back from the street, but she saw us and gave me a glance that I shall be long in forgetting. That look was quite enough for me. I knew Miss Raymond to be Mrs. Herbert. As for Mrs. Beaumont, she had quite gone out of my head. She went into the house, and I watched it till 4 o'clock, when she came out, and then I followed her. It was a long chase, and I had to be very careful to keep a long way in the background, and yet not lose sight of the woman. She took me down to the Strand, and then to Westminster, and then up St. James Street, and along Piccadilly. I felt queerish when I saw her turn up Ashley Street. The thought that Mrs. Herbert was Mrs. Beaumont came into my mind, but it seemed too improbable to be true. I waited at the corner, keeping my eye on her all the time, and I took particular care to note the house at which she stopped. It was the house with the gay curtains, the house of flowers, the house out of which Crashaw came the night he hanged himself in his garden. I was just going away with my discovery when I saw an empty carriage come round and draw up in front of the house, and I came to the conclusion that Mrs. Herbert was going out for a drive, and I was right. I took a hansom and followed the carriage into the park. There, as it happened, I met a man I know, and we stood talking together a little distance from the carriageway, to which I had my back. We had not been there for 10 minutes, when my friend took off his hat, and I glanced round and saw the lady I had been following all day. "Who is that?" I said, and his answer was, "Mrs. Beaumont lives in Ashley Street." Of course, there could be no doubt after that. I don't know whether she saw me, but I don't think she did. I went home at once, and on consideration I thought that I had a sufficiently good case with which to go to Clark. Why to Clark? Because I'm sure that Clark is in possession of facts about this woman, facts of which I know nothing. Well, what then? Mr. Villiers leaned back in his chair and looked reflectively at Austin for a moment before he answered. My idea was that Clark and I should call on Mrs. Beaumont. You would never go into such a house as that. No, Villiers, you cannot do it. Besides, consider, what result? I will tell you soon. But I was going to say that my information does not end here. It has been completed in an extraordinary manner. Look at this neat little packet of manuscript. It's paginated, you see, and I've indulged in the civil coquetry of a ribbon of red tape. It has almost a legal air, doesn't it? Run your eye over it, Austin. It is an account of the entertainment Mrs. Beaumont provided for her choicer guests. The man who wrote this escaped with his life, but I do not think he will live many years. The doctors tell him he must have sustained some severe shock to the nerves. Austin took the manuscript, but never read it. Opening the neat pages at haphazard, his eye was caught by a word and a phrase that followed it, and sick at heart, with white lips and a cold sweat pouring like water from his temples, he flung the paper down. "Take it away, Villiers. Never speak of this again. Are you made of stone, man? Why, the dread and horror of death itself, the thoughts of the man who stands in the keen morning air on the black platform, bound, the bell tolling in his ears, and waits for the harsh rattle of the bolts, are as nothing compared to this. I will not read it. I should never sleep again."
Very good. I can fancy what you saw. Yes, it is horrible enough. But after all, it is an old story, an old mystery played in our day, and in dim London streets instead of amidst the vineyards and the olive gardens. We know what happened to those who chanced to meet the great god Pan, and those who are wise know that all symbols are symbols of something, not of nothing. It was indeed an exquisite symbol beneath which men long ago veiled their knowledge of the most awful, most secret forces which lie at the heart of all things. Forces before which the souls of men must wither and die and blacken, as their bodies blacken under the electric current. Such forces cannot be named, cannot be spoken, cannot be imagined, except under a veil and a symbol to the most of us appearing a quaint poetic fancy, to some a foolish tale. But you and I, at all events, have known something of the terror that may dwell in this secret place of life, manifested under human flesh, that which is without form, taking to itself a form. Oh, Austin, how can it be? How is it that the very sunlight does not turn to blackness before this thing? The hard earth melt and boil beneath such a burden.
Villiers was pacing up and down the room, and the beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. Austin sat silent for a while, but Villiers saw him make a sign upon his breast.
"I say again, Villiers, you will surely never enter such a house as that."
Oh, excuse me, wrong voice. "I say again, Villiers, you will surely never enter such a house as that. You would never pass out alive."
"Yes, Austin, I shall go out alive. I, and Clark with me."
"What do you mean? You cannot. You would not dare."
"Wait a moment." The air was very pleasant and fresh this morning. There was a breeze blowing even through this dull street, and I thought I would take a walk. Piccadilly stretched before me, a clear, bright vista, and the sun flashed on the carriages and on the quivering leaves in the park. It was a joyous morning, and men and women looked at the sky and smiled as they went about their work or their pleasure, and the wind blew as blithely as upon the meadows and the scented gorse. But somehow or other I got out of the bustle and the gaiety, and found myself walking slowly along a quiet, dull street, where there seemed to be no sunshine and no air, and where the few foot passengers loitered as they walked, and hung indecisively about corners and archways. I walked along, hardly knowing where I was going or what I did there, but feeling impelled, as one sometimes is, to explore still further, with a vague idea of reaching some unknown goal. Thus I forged up the street, noting the small traffic of the milk shop, and wondering at the incongruous medley of penny pipes, black tobacco, sweets, newspapers, and comic songs which here and there jostled one another in the short compass of a single window. I think it was a cold shudder that suddenly passed through me that first told me that I had found what I wanted. I looked up from the pavement and stopped before a dusty shop, above which the lettering had faded, where the red bricks of 200 years ago had grimed to black, where the windows had gathered to themselves the fog and the dirt of winters innumerable. I saw what I required, but I think it was 5 minutes before I had steadied myself and could walk in and ask for it in a cool voice and with a calm face.
I think there must even then have been a tremor in my words, for the old man who came out from his black parlour and fumbled slowly amongst his goods looked oddly at me as he tied the parcel. I paid what he asked and stood leaning by the counter with a strange reluctance to take up my goods and go. I asked about the business and learnt that trade was bad and the profits cut down sadly. But then the street was not what it was before traffic had been diverted, but that was done 40 years ago. Just before my father died, he said. I got away at last and walked along sharply. It was a dismal street indeed, and I was glad to return to the bustle and the noise. Would you like to see my purchase? Austin said nothing, but nodded his head slightly. He still looked white and sick. Villiers pulled out a drawer in the bamboo table and showed Austin a long coil of cord, hard and new, and at one end was a running noose. It is the best hempen cord, said Villiers, just as it used to be made for the old trade, the man told me. Not an inch of jute from one end to an end. Austin set his teeth hard and stared at Villiers, growing whiter as he looked. You would not do it, he murmured at last. You would not have blood on your hands. My God, he exclaimed with sudden vehemence. You cannot mean this, Villiers, that you would make yourself a hangman? I shall offer a choice and leave Helen Vaughan alone with this cord in a locked room for 15 minutes. If when we go in it is not done, I shall call the nearest policeman, that is all. I must go now. I cannot stay here any longer. I cannot bear this. Good night. Good night, Austin. The door shut, but in a moment it was opened again, and Austin stood white and ghastly in the entrance. I was forgetting, he said. I too have something to tell. I have received a letter from Dr. Harding of Buenos Aires. He says that he attended Mayrick for 3 weeks before his death. And does he say what carried him off in the prime of life? It was not fever. Oh, it was not fever. According to the doctor, it was an utter collapse of the whole system, probably caused by some severe shock. But he states that the patient would tell him nothing and that he was consequently at some disadvantage in treating the case. Is there anything more? Yes. Dr. Harding ends his letter by saying, I think this is all the information I can give you about your poor friend. He had not been long in Buenos Aires and knew scarcely anyone, with the exception of a person who did not bear the best of characters and has since left, a Mrs. Vaughan. Part 8. The Fragments. Amongst the papers of the well-known physician Dr. Robert Matheson of Ashley Street, Piccadilly, who died suddenly of an apoplectic seizure at the beginning of 1892, a leaf of manuscript paper was found covered with pencil jottings. These notes were in Latin, much abbreviated, and has evidently been made in great haste. The manuscript was only deciphered with great difficulty, and some words have up to the present time evaded all the efforts of the expert employed. The date, XXV Jul 1888, is written on the right-hand corner of the manuscript. The following is a translation of Dr. Matheson's manuscript. Whether science would benefit by these brief notes if they could be published, I do not know, but rather doubt. But certainly I shall never take the responsibility of publishing or divulging one word of what is here written, not only on account of my oath freely given to those 2 persons who are present, but also because the details are too abominable. It is probably that, upon mature consideration, after weighing the good and evil, I shall one day destroy this paper, or at least leave it under seal to my friend D., trusting in his discretion to use it or to burn it as he may think fit. As was befitting, I did all that my knowledge suggested to make sure that I was suffering under no delusion. At first, astounded, I could hardly think, but in a minute's time I was sure that my pulse was steady and regular, and that I was in my real and true senses. I then fixed my eyes quietly on what was before me. The horror and revolting nausea rose up within me, and an odor of corruption choked my breath. I remained firm. I was then privileged, or accursed, I dare not say which, to that which was on the bed, lying there, black like ink, transformed before my eyes. The skin and the flesh and the muscles and the bones and the firm structure of the human body that I had thought to be unchangeable and permanent as adamant began to melt and dissolve. I knew that the body may be separated into its elements by external agencies, but I should have refused to believe what I saw. To hear there was some internal force of which I knew nothing that caused dissolution and change. Here too was all the work by which man had been made repeated before my eyes. I saw the form waver from sex to sex, dividing itself from itself, and then again reunited. Then I saw the body descend to the beasts whence it ascended, and that was on the heights, and that which was on the heights go down to the depths, even to the abyss of all being. The principle of life, which makes organism, always remained, while the outward form changed. The light within the room had turned to blackness, not the darkness of night, in which objects are seen dimly, for I could see clearly and without difficulty, but it was the negation of light. Objects were presented to my eyes, if I may say so, without any medium, in such a manner as if there had been a prism in the room. I should have seen no colours represented in it. I watched, and at last I saw nothing but a substance as jelly. Then the ladder was ascended again. Here the manuscript is illegible. For one instant I saw a form shaped in dimness before me, which I will not farther describe. But the symbol of this form may be seen in ancient sculptures and in paintings which survived beneath the lava, too foul to be spoken of. As a horrible and unspeakable shape, neither man nor beast, was changed into human form. There came finally death. I, who saw all of this, not without great horror and loathing of soul, here write my name, declaring all that I have said on this paper to be true. Robert Matheson, medical doctor. Such, Raymond, is the story of what I know and what I've seen. The burden of it was too heavy for me to bear alone, and yet I could tell it to none but you. Villiers, who was with me at the last, knows nothing of that awful secret of the wood, of how what we both saw die lay under the smooth, sweet turf amidst the summer flowers, half in sun and half in shadow, and holding the girl Rachel's hand, called and summoned those companions, and shaped in solid form upon the earth we tread on the horror which we can but hint at, which we can only name under a figure. I would not tell Villiers of this, nor of that resemblance which struck me as with a blow upon my heart when I saw the portrait, which filled the cup of terror at the end. What this can mean I dare not guess. I know that what I saw perish was not Mary, and yet in the last agony Mary's eyes looked into mine. Whether there be any one who can show the last link in this chain of awful mystery, I do not know, but if there be any one who can do this, you, Raymond, are the man, and if you know the secret, it rests with you to tell it, or not, as you please. I am writing this letter to you immediately on my getting back to town. I've been in the country for the last few days. Perhaps you may be able to guess in what part. While the horror and wonder of London was at its height, for Mrs. Beaumont, as I have told you, was well known in society, I wrote to my friend Dr. Phillips, giving some brief outline, or rather hint, of what had happened, and asking him to tell me the name of the village where the events he had related to me occurred. He gave me the name, as he said, with the less hesitation, because Rachel's father and mother were dead, and the rest of the family had gone to a relative in the state of Washington 6 months before. The parents, he said, had undoubtedly died of grief and horror caused by the terrible death of their daughter, and by what had gone before that death. On the evening of the day on which I received Philip's letter, I was at Caermain, and standing beneath the mouldering Roman walls, white with the winters of 1700 years, I looked over the meadow where once had stood the older temple of the gods of the deeps, and saw a house gleaming in the sunlight. It was the house where Helen had lived. I stayed at Caermain for several days. The people of the place I found knew little, and had guessed less. Those whom I spoke to on the matter seemed surprised that an antiquarian, as I professed myself to be, should trouble about a village tragedy, of which they gave a very commonplace version, and as you may imagine, I told nothing of what I knew. Most of my time was spent in the great wood that rises just above the village and climbs the hillside, and goes down to the river in the valley. Such another long, lovely valley, Raymond, is that on which we looked one summer night, walking to and fro before your house. For many an hour I strayed through the maze of the forest, turning now to right and now to left, pacing slowly down long alleys of undergrowth, shadowy and chill, even under the midday sun, and halting beneath great oaks lying on the short turf of a clearing where the faint, sweet scent of wild roses came to me on the wind and mixed with the heavy perfume of the elder, whose mingled odour is like the odour of the room of the dead, a vapour of incense and corruption. I stood at the edges of the wood, gazing at all the pomp and procession of the foxgloves towering amidst the bracken and shining red in the broad sunshine, and beyond them into deep thickets of close undergrowth where springs boil up from the rock and nourish the water weeds dank and evil. But in all my wanderings I avoided one part of the wood. It was not till yesterday that I climbed to the summit of the hill and stood upon the ancient Roman road that threads the highest ridge of the wood. Here they had walked, Helen and Rachel, along this quiet causeway upon the pavement of green turf, shut in on either side by high banks of red earth and tall hedges of shining beech. And here I followed in their steps, looking out now and again through partings in the boughs and seeing on one side the sweep of the wood stretching far to the right and left and sinking into the broad level, and beyond the yellow sea and the land over the sea. On the other side was the valley and the river, and hill following hill as wave on wave, and wood and meadow and cornfield, and white houses gleaming, and a great wall of mountain, and far blue peaks in the north. And so at last I came to the place. The track went up a gentle slope and widened out into an open space with a wall of thick undergrowth around it, and then narrowing again, passed on into the distance in the faint blue mist of summer heat. And into this pleasant summer glade Rachel passed a girl and left it. Who shall say what? I did not stay long there. In a small town near Carmaine there is a museum containing for the most part Roman remains which have been found in the neighbourhood at various times. On the day after my arrival at Carmaine I walked over to the town in question and took the opportunity of inspecting this museum. After I had seen most of the sculptured stones, the coffins, rings, coins, and fragments of tessellated pavement which the place contains, I was shown a small square pillar of white stone, which had been recently discovered in the wood of which I had been speaking, and, as I found on inquiry, in that open space where the Roman road broadens out. On one side of the pillar was an inscription, of which I took a note. Some of the letters had been defaced, but I do not think there can be any doubt as to those which I supply. The inscription is as follows. Divum nodenti flavivs senilis posvit propternutius causvidit sububra. To the great god Nodens, the god of the great deep or abyss, Flavius Senilis has erected this pillar on account of the marriage which he saw beneath the shade. The custodian of the museum informed me that local antiquaries were much puzzled, not by the inscription or by any difficulty in translating it, but as to the circumstances or rite to which allusion is made. And now, my dear Clark, as to what you tell me about Helen Vaughan, whom you say you saw die under circumstances of the utmost and almost incredible horror, I was interested in your account, but a good deal, nay, all of what you told me, I knew already. I can understand the strange likeness you remarked, both in the portrait and in the actual face. You've seen Helen's mother. You remember that still summer night so many years ago when I talked to you of the world beyond the shadows and of the god Pan. You remember Mary. She was the mother of Helen Vaughan, who was born 9 months after that night. Mary never recovered her reason. She lay as you saw her all the while upon her bed, and a few days after the child was born, she died. I fancy that just at the last she knew me. I was standing by the bed, and the old look came into her eyes for a second, and then she shuddered and groaned and died. It was an ill work I did that night when you were present. I broke open the door of the house of life without knowing or caring what might pass forth or enter in. I recollect your telling me at the time, sharply enough, and rightly enough too, in one sense, that I had ruined the reason of a human being by a foolish experiment based on an absurd theory. You did well to blame me, but my theory was not all absurdity. What I said Mary would see, she saw, but I forgot that no human eyes could look on such a vision with impunity. And I forgot, as I have just said, that when the house of life is thus thrown open, there may enter in that for which we have no name, and human flesh may become the veil of a horror one dare not express. I played with energies which I did not understand, and you have seen the ending of it. Helen Vaughan did well to bind the cord about her neck and die, though the death was horrible. The blackened face, the hideous form upon the bed, changing and melting before your eyes from woman to man, from man to beast, and from beast to worse than beast. All the strange horror that you witnessed surprises me but little. What you say the doctor whom you sent for saw and shuddered at, I noticed long ago. I knew what I had done the moment the child was born, and when it was scarcely 5 years old, I surprised it not once or twice, but several times with a playmate. You may guess of what kind. It was for me a constant and incarnate horror, and after a few years I felt I could bear it no longer, and I sent Helen Vaughan away. You know now what frightened the boy in the wood. The rest of the strange story, and all else that you tell me, is discovered by your friend. I've contrived to learn from time to time, almost to the last chapter. And now Helen is with her companions.